So, welcome for Physiology. This lecture here deals with excitable tissues, and in particular how their structure tells you something about what they do. From several times before, what we've dealt with is emergent properties, meaning the total is more than its parts. So if we look at a tissue, it can do things that its parts, which are just cells, cannot do. And if I keep looking at those tissues, there's four different types. So we have epithelium and connective tissues, so we have coverings and linings, and we have the glue. But then we have these last two, muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and they turn out to be what we call excitable tissues, namely because they both happen to react to electricity. They produce electricity, and they are responsive to electricity, which is why we call them excitable. They will do things. By far the most complicated of those would be muscle tissue. So when we look at muscle tissue, either skeletal, cardiac, or smooth, they turn out to have a level of organization to the inside of them. They have lots of internal parts. Smooth muscle turns out to have the least in terms of internal parts, but we also notice that they turn out to be the least controllable. They function on their own. When they contract, they kind of look like an earthworm. If you can imagine what an earthworm looks like when it moves, that's what smooth muscle turns out to look like. You'll find this inside of organs, so any type of organ that's a tube, you will find smooth muscle. The opposite end of that spectrum would be skeletal muscle, and it turns out to be really, really complicated and very, very, very organized. Skeletal muscle, unlike smooth muscle, is always found attached to a skeleton, but it also turns out to be under, for the most part, our conscious control. It's a voluntary muscle. We choose to contract them or not contract them. The thing that's in between would be cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is kind of structured like skeletal muscle, but it has the I can function on my own version that smooth muscle turns out to have. We also only find this inside of the heart, so its name makes sense of cardiac muscle because it's found in the heart. All of those turn out to be influenced, whether or not they're under the total control of is irrelevant, but they are influenced by nervous tissue. Nervous tissue has two major components. One of them would be the neuron, and all we notice with the neuron is it's one cell, so it's this middle portion right here, and then we have these little wires that stick out, and depending on what they look like, we give them different names of either dendrites, or we call them an axon, or telodendria, so meaning dendrites on the far side, or whatever. So we have different words that we can attribute to different parts of these things. And what we notice is they're really simple on the inside, and all they do is conduct electricity. That's all they do. It's a bunch of wires. Nothing more, nothing less. In order to help them do their job, we have things called glial cells or neuroglia or neural glial cells. And what these things turn out to do is they help out with making sure that the nervous tissue, so the neurons, do whatever they're supposed to do. And they have various functions. Turns out the glial cells are the ones that can reproduce rather easily, so typically when you think of a brain tumor or a spinal cord tumor or something like that, it's actually the glial cells that have the issues, not the neurons. These things get clumped together, and outside of the fact that they're excitable, they turn out to both form what we call a reflex arc. And all we mean by a reflex is you have a sensory input, you process what to do with it, and then you have some type of action. And that combination of receive input, process it, do something, we call a reflex. And what makes it rather fun and depressing at the exact same time is that when we look at reflexes in the human body, they always result in two things. Either one, they're going to make some type of excretion like saliva, or they're going to release enzymes, or they're going to release hormones or something along those lines, or it's going to cause a muscle to contract. And that's all you turn out to be able to do. You make excretions and your muscles contract.